Hello, Namaste and welcome you all. In our last lecture, we have discussed contribution at BP sales level and margin of safety sales level. Now today we are going to understand new concept of marginal costing technique, that is PV ratio. PV ratio stands for profit volume ratio, that is profit sales volume ratio. But actually this is not profit to sales ratio, actually this is contribution to sales ratio, but it is popularly known as profit to sales ratio, but it is not actually profit to sales ratio. This is a ratio of contribution to sales, or in other words we can say this is contribution to sales ratio. Actually PV ratio is not profit to sales ratio. PV ratio is not profit to sales ratio. This is contribution to sales ratio. So why it is called as profit volume ratio or PV ratio? Because contribution includes fixed cost and profit, and contribution is utilized to recover the fixed cost. Once complete fixed cost get recovered, then all contribution get form of profit. That's why the contribution to sales ratio is also called as profit volume ratio, but technically it is a contribution to sales ratio. Means whenever you are asked to calculate the profit volume ratio, then you have to take contribution to sales ratio. You have to take meaning contribution to sales ratio. Actually this is not profit to sales ratio, this is contribution to sales ratio. Okay, so PV ratio means actually it is contribution to sales ratio, or it is also called as marginal ratio. Means how to calculate PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio? As the name indicates, contribution to sales ratio. PV ratio is also called as contribution to sales ratio, or we can say PV ratio is actually the contribution to sales ratio. So as the name indicates, contribution to sales, contribution to sales ratio, contribution upon sales into 100. So what this PV ratio tells us? It tells, PV ratio tells or shows percentage of contribution to sales. Percentage of contribution to sales. You can see here, if contribution is 600 and total sales are 1000, 600 divided by 1000 into 100 is equal to PV ratio will be 60%. PV ratio means contribution to sales ratio. Means if PV ratio is 60%, means contribution is 60% of sales. PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 60%, means what? This is a contribution to sales ratio. If that ratio is 60%, means contribution to sales, means contribution is 60% of sales. PV ratio tells us what it tells us? The percentage of, PV ratio tells us the percentage of contribution to sales. Here suppose contribution is 600, sales is 1000. So 600 divided by 1000 into 100. So PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 60%, means contribution is 60% of sales. You can see contribution here is 600 and which is 60% of sales. What PV ratio tells us? It tells the percentage of contribution to sales. Okay, what we have discussed? We have discussed what is a PV ratio. PV ratio stands for profit volume ratio, but actually it is not profit volume ratio, it is actually contribution to sales ratio. Okay, technically it is contribution to sales ratio. It tells us the percentage of contribution to sales. Okay, we have discussed what is meant by PV ratio. PV ratio is the ratio which shows or which tells the percentage of contribution to sales. And how to calculate PV ratio? The formula is contribution upon sales into 100. Suppose contribution amount rupees 600, sales amount rupees 1000. So 600 upon 1000 into 100. So PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 60%. It means If PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 60%, it means what? It means contribution is 60% of sales. If PV ratio is 60%, it means contribution is 60% of sales. Or if PV ratio is 20%, if PV ratio is 20%, then what does it mean? It means contribution is 20% of sales. Now, with the help of one example, we are going to understand utility of PV ratio. Suppose sales is rupees 1000 and PV ratio given which is 20%, then what will be the amount of contribution? So in our example, sales is given which is rupees 1000, PV ratio is given which is 20%. By giving after giving these two items, we are asked to calculate the contribution. Okay, we know the PV ratio, means what we know? We know the contribution to sales ratio, means what we know, that is contribution to sales ratio is 20%, means contribution is 20% of sales. So we have the amount of sales. So if we multiply sales by PV ratio, we will get the amount of contribution. If our sales is 1000 into 20% PV ratio, why we have multiplied PV ratio? Because PV ratio tells the percentage of contribution to sales. Means if PV ratio is 20%, means contribution is 20% of sales. Suppose our sales is 1000 into 20% PV ratio is equal to rupees 200 will be the amount of contribution. So up to this stage, what we have discussed? We have discussed what is mean by PV ratio. PV ratio stands for profit volume sales, means profit sales volume ratio. But actually this is not a profit to sales ratio. This is contribution to sales ratio. This is actually contribution to sales ratio. How to calculate it? PV ratio is equal to contribution upon sales into 100. And what PV ratio tells us? It tells us the percentage of contribution to sales. Means if PV ratio is 60%, means contribution is 60% of sales. If PV ratio is 10%, it means contribution is 10% of sales. If our PV ratio is 90%, means our contribution is 90% of sales. We have taken one example also. Suppose sales are given and PV ratio is given, then we can easily find out the amount of contribution by multiplying sales by PV ratio. Sales suppose 1000, PV ratio suppose 20%. So 1000 into 20% PV ratio is equal to rupees 200 will be the amount of contribution. Now next, what PV ratio indicates? What PV ratio indicates? PV ratio indicates the percentage of sales value. Percentage of sales value available to recover the fixed cost. And finally the earnings of profit. Means percentage of sales. The value of percentage of sales which will be utilized to recover our fixed cost, and then finally earning profit. Percentage of what we utilize to recover fixed cost? Contribution we utilize. So contribution percentage, PV ratio tells us or indicates us contribution, percentage of contribution to sales. Next, suppose if PV ratio is 20%, suppose PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 20%, then what it means? What it means? Suppose someone tells us PV ratio is 20%, then what it means? As we know, the accounting is a language of business. So PV ratio also giving somewhat meaning. It passes on some meaning. So what meaning it passes? PV ratio is 20% means what? It means contribution is 20% of sales. It means fixed cost is 20% of BEP sales, and it means profit is 20% of margin of safety sales. How? Now we are going to discuss. Contribution is 20% of sales. If PV ratio means contribution to sales ratio is 20%, means contribution is 20% of sales. It is okay. But what about second? Fixed cost is 20% of BEP sales. Why? Because at BEP stage, as we discussed in the previous lecture, at BEP stage, the contribution amount and fixed cost amount is exactly equal. As we discussed in the last lecture, at BEP level means BEP level contribution and fixed cost amount is always equal. So BEP level contribution, this is sales level is BEP level. Okay, at BEP level contribution amount is always equal to fixed cost amount. And what PV ratio tells us? PV ratio tells us that contribution is 20% of sales. So if contribution, BEP level contribution is 20% of BEP sales, then fixed cost will also be equal to that contribution. That's why fixed cost is also 20% of BEP sales. Why? Because at BEP sales level, contribution amount and fixed cost amount always equal. If contribution is 20% of BEP sales, then fixed cost will also be 20% of BEP sales. Because at BEP stage, fixed cost amount and contribution amount is always equal. At BEP level, amount of contribution and the amount of fixed cost is always equal, as we have discussed in the previous lecture. Fixed cost is 20% of BEP sales, as at BEP level contribution is in the form of fixed cost. That's why this happens, as we have discussed in the last lecture. Now what about third? If PV ratio is 20%, then it means profit is 20% of margin of safety sales. Why? At margin of safety sales level, the total profit amount and contribution at margin of safety sales level amount is always equal. That's why it happens. Or in other words, we can say, if PV ratio is 20%, means contribution to sales ratio is 20%, then it means the profit is 20% of margin of safety sales, because at margin of safety sales level, contribution is in the form of profit. Contribution is in the form of profit. That's why it happens. At margin of safety sales level, the amount of contribution and amount of profit is always equal, as we have discussed in the previous lecture. So at margin of safety sales level, if contribution is 20% of margin of safety sales, then profit will also be 20% of margin of safety sales, because at margin of safety sales level, the profit amount and contribution amount is always equal. That's why at margin of safety sales level, if contribution is 20%, then profit will also be 20%, because at margin of safety sales level, profit amount and contribution amount is always equal at margin of safety sales level. So up to this stage, what we have discussed? We have discussed meaning of PV ratio. PV stands for profit volume ratio. Volume means sales volume. Profit sales volume ratio means profit to volume sales volume ratio. But actually it is not profit to sales ratio. This is a ratio of contribution to sales. Contribution to sales. This is a PV ratio is actually contribution to sales ratio. Why it is called as profit volume ratio? Because it is a contribution which recovers fixed cost, and once complete fixed cost get recovered, all contribution take form of profit. That's why contribution to sales ratio is also known as profit to sales ratio. That's why it is popularly known as profit volume ratio. But technically it is actually contribution to sales ratio, which is also called as marginal ratio or contribution ratio. What PV ratio tells us? It tells percentage of contribution to sales. And how to calculate it? Contribution upon sales into 100 is equal to PV ratio. Suppose contribution is 600, sales is 1600 upon 1000 into 100, then PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio will be 60%. And if contribution to sales ratio, that is PV ratio, is 60%, it means our contribution is 60% of sales. If our PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 10%, then our contribution is 10% of sales. Okay. So we have taken one example. Suppose sales is 1000, PV ratio is given, which is 20%. Then what will be amount of contribution? We know PV ratio means contribution to sales ratio. What it tells us? It tells contribution is 20% of sales. So sales is given. So sales into 20%. So 20% of sales. Sales is 1000. So 20% of 1000 will be 200, and that will be the amount of contribution. Okay. Now PV ratio indicates what? It indicates the percentage of sales value available to recover the fixed cost and finally the earnings of the profit. Then if PV ratio 20%, what does it mean? As we know, the accounting is a language of business. So anything passes some message. So what message it passes? PV ratio is 20% or contribution to sales ratio is 20%. What it means? What it means? If PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 20%, it means contribution is 20% of sales. And if PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 20%, then it means fixed cost is 20% of BEP sales, because at BEP level contribution is in the form of fixed cost. At BEP level the amount of fixed cost and contribution is always equal. If contribution is 20% of BEP sales, then fixed cost will also be 20% of BEP sales, because at BEP level fixed cost and contribution amount are always equal, as we discussed in the previous lecture. In same way, in third case, if PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is 20%, then it means profit is 20% of margin of safety sales, because at margin of safety sales level contribution is in the form of profit. That's why it happens. At margin of safety sales level, the amount of profit and the amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level is always equal, as we discussed in the last lecture. If total profit amount and contribution at margin of safety sales level, not total contribution, contribution at margin of safety sales level, the amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level and amount of total profit is always equal at margin of safety sales level. That's why if contribution at margin of safety sales level is 20% of margin of safety sales, then profit will also be 20% of margin of safety sales, because that at that level profit and contribution amount are always equal, as we discussed in the previous lecture. So I hope all of you have understood it. In our next lecture we are going to understand how to calculate the PV ratio or alternative ways to calculate PV ratio or various formulas to calculate PV ratio. We will going to discuss in our next lecture. Thank you.